Well, good day and welcome to SOP, Save Our Planet. My name is Gary Willing and I hope wherever you are, you're having a great day. Now, I am going to try my very best to answer a question that came my way. It's a simple question, but it's a question that I've asked a lot over the years, and I'm sure you have asked this question yourself. I'm going to get on into it in a second, but if you have a question you want to ask me, feel free to post that question in the comments section. Email me, searchforsigns@mail.com, and I'll do my very best to try to answer it in another video. Or simply let me know what you think by posting a comment. But in the meantime, if you want to get those questions answered for yourself, go to the Share International site. You'll get really good answers to some of the questions you might have about what I talk about here. So the link is in the description of this video. All right, so what is this question that I'm going to try to answer? It is real simple. It is, how do we stop this madness? Now, they put a crying emoji in there, and you can really cry when you ask that question because you can really choose to cry or laugh. And sometimes, Mr. Stevens, sometimes you just have to choose to laugh. You know, I hate to say it, but I'm not laughing at your question because it's a serious question. How do we stop this madness? How do we stop this madness as a humanity? Right? Is one way to answer that question. I'm going to try to answer it that way. But also, I'm going to try to answer it another way, which is, how do we stop this madness being an individual? You know, because that's also a very important question to ask yourself as well, right? Now, looking at all the problems that are facing humanity today, right? There are a lot of them. One thing to keep in mind is that the big problems, the environmental problem, injustice, war, crime, terrorism, diseases of all kinds are all affecting each and every one of us, without exception. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what country you're in, and it doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account or how little money you have in your bank account. Those problems are affecting each and every one of us. Okay, now, they might seem insurmountable because we keep getting bombarded with the problems. The problems aren't being solved, and the more we talk about it, the more we obsess about it, the more we feel that there's nothing that we can do. There's nothing that we can do as a humanity, right? And there's nothing that we can do individually, which is incorrect. Maitreya says the problems are real but solvable. Man must just simply act and implement his will. That's it. He also went on to say that the problems are man-made and can be solved by man. None of these problems that I just listed, and you can list more problems if you want, are caused by any external factors other than the work and activity of humanity. That's it. So when it comes to the environment is being abused not by animals, not by God, but by humanity. So if we want to solve the environmental problem, we just have to stop doing what we've been doing. It's really what it amounts to, right? It's pretty simple. But how do we get to where we're on the same page? How do we start to cooperate? That is the question, right? Because the reason why we have these problems is because we're not cooperating, because we're competing against one another, because there's this terrible disease in the lives of humanity, and it's called commercialization. It's affecting everything. And that is the problem. It all stems back to commercialization. Everything, from political corruption, economic divisions, geopolitical, instability, to even the environment, is all caused by the problem and the disease of commercialization. When I try to answer how do we stop this madness globally as a humanity, believe it or not, it's actually has a simpler answer than it is when I try to answer it, how do we stop the madness individually? How do we stop it globally is very simple. Humanity must implement the principle of sharing at some point. We won't do it until we're really up against it. We won't do it until Maitreya really shows us that our future depends on whether we do try the principle of sharing. And once we do it, we'll see how much it affects everything and it changes everything. We're going to go, why didn't we do this years ago? It's crazy. The world we're living in today would not be the world that we're living in today had we tried the principle of sharing when it started and kept it going, which was during the Marshall Plan right after World War II. We'd be living in a totally different world today. There would have never been a 9/11. There would have never been COVID. There would have never been all these political tensions that are going on in the world today, there would not, all the people who have starved needlessly in a world of plenty would still be with us at some point, but and they might have passed away, but not because of starvation. There would have never been the Vietnam War. There would have never been the Cold War. All that would have been it would have never happened. And the world that we would have been living in today would be totally different. We would relate to each other totally differently. Nations would trust each other totally differently. Now, seems like an extraordinary claim now, doesn't it? But historically, and this is something that I talk about in nearly every video because it is so important that we need to talk about this repeatedly. And that is, there was a time right after World War II when the principle of sharing was tried, and it was miraculous what happened. And it only lasted for just a few years, and it only was, worked upon and participated with just a few nations. And I always ask myself this question: what would the world be like had we done it with every nation after World War II and it never ended? I mean, it would have just been, like I said, we'd be living in a totally different world. But if you research the Marshall Plan, look at the nations that participated in it. They're mainly the Western European nations and the United States. The nations that participated in the Marshall Plan, if you look at their history, they had been at war with one another at some point. World War I and World War II are textbook examples of when they were at war with one another. There was conflict, there was tension, there was war. Since then, none of them have participated in any kind of conflict with each other. Now, I'm not going to say that it's permanent because it could be headed in the direction of one of those nations attacking one another because we have not reinstituted the principle of sharing, and we have a moron in chief who's doing everything in his power to destabilize those alliances for his own benefit, for whatever reason, other than his own ego and his own benefit. But he's a chaotic figure that's creating chaos. And those nations that typically have trusted one another for decades are starting to distrust one another and start to compete again more and more and more. So where that will lead to is probably not peace. It's never brought peace. That's the other thing. So that's something to consider too. So, if it goes on for a few more years, I might not be able to say that anymore. But as of the recording of this video, none of those nations have attacked one another. But what is the principle of sharing? Well, nations have excesses of resources literally just sitting there. And most of those resources, especially if they're perishable, go bad. And they don't need to go bad. And all they have to do is just take those resources that would have just gone bad and give them to another nation. That is the principle of sharing. And then those nations that use those perishable resources or use those building products or whatever to build up their own nation, they can give back an excess of two that they have. That's the principle of sharing. That's what happened during the Marshall Plan. Now, two major concerns that people in America have, I think, are ludicrous if you really look at it historically and really understand the principle of sharing, but it is a knee-jerk reaction based on their own ideology and their own form of isolationism, which is a form of ideology. Isolationism is an ideology. So when you bring up the principle of sharing to Americans, their first concern is they need to keep all those resources for themselves. Don't give them to another nation, right? That's pretty much what they think. Ironically, the nation that they so love that they want to hoard those resources for is even hoarding it from their own people. So it would be great if the United States even gave up some of those resources for its own people, but they're not willing to do that either. But there's more than enough resources for not only the people here in the United States, just on the resources that go bad every year, but we have enough for everybody here in the United States, but we also have enough for people around the world too. Now, the other concern that people have is they think that the United States is just going to be the giver, and everyone's just going to take. That's not the principle of sharing. The principle of sharing is there's a give and a take. So the United States would give resources to another country. Those nations would have to give back in payment what they took. That's also what happened during the Marshall Plan, which is why it was a form of principle of sharing. So a good historical example of the reverse of what most Americans are thinking was when we had a very brutal winter here in the United States. And Hugo Chavez, who's not loved in this country at all, is actually hated in this country by the press and by most people because of the press and also by our own government, was a actual, he was a dictator in a way, but he was also he had a good heart because he actually saw the suffering of the people of the United States in this cold, and he had the ability to help. So what he offered up was free natural gas and free heating oil for the U.S. citizens. He was going to give it to us for the people in the Northeast to use for free. That is a form of the principle of sharing. Unfortunately, Bush was a moron, and he didn't take him up on that offer. And he allowed his own people to suffer. That's why I'm calling him a moron. If George Bush's heart was half as open as Hugo Chavez was, he would have taken that and used it to help his people for free, but he wouldn't do it. So commercialization is a bitch for sure. But anywho, that is also an example of a nation giving to the United States and not the other way around. Okay, so that should help alleviate some of that concern. Now, this is where it comes down to you and I. Okay, so I can only share with you or recommend to any one of you what I'm doing. I can't tell you to do something that I'm not doing myself. But there are other ways of helping the world, and you might see that there's another way that suits you. But that would be something for you to come up for yourself. So the only thing I can suggest for each and every one of you to help stop the madness is to do what I'm doing, which is talk about the need for peace with people. You don't have to make it a thing and do a YouTube and a TikTok channel and go on Instagram or Facebook and talk about it, but you can talk about it with your friends and family. Educate yourself. Start there. Educate yourself with about the need for peace, about how to bring about justice, and how to bring about justice through the principle of sharing. Read about it. Educate yourself on the Marshall Plan, so when those concerns come up, you can talk to them about it. Be a little more confident to talk to people about the principle of sharing. Okay, so that would be a way that you could help stop the madness. Talk to your, elected leaders about the need for peace, perhaps, or whatever. So there's a lot of different ways that you can talk about this, that you can share it with people. If you believe in any way, shape, or form about what I'm saying about Maitreya, share it at that level. Help prepare the way for the teacher into the lives of humanity by just talking to them about it. But if you don't believe in that, and you believe in the principle of sharing or believe in the need for peace, then talk about that. If you don't believe that the principle of sharing is anything to do with anything, and you don't believe that Maitreya is anything to do with anything, you can always share hope and joy. Because people are getting bombarded, and I'm sure you are too, with nothing but negative news. And it's creating a depression in the psyche of humanity. We need hope. We need to know that we're going to be okay. Share joy with people. We all have the capacity for joy. You can do one or all or two or all three of those things to help stop the madness. But just keep in mind something that Maitreya said years ago through the disciple Helena Roach in the Agna Yoga teachings. He said, a long, long time ago, one true man could save the world. Then there was a time when 10,000 wasn't enough. In the coming time, I will call on 1 billion people. In fact, he's got 1.5 billion people that he is going to ask to help restore the planet, bring it back to health, to bring about justice in the world, to help beautify our cities, to help bring about and create justice and peace and those kind of things, to help the principle of sharing. If you're listening to this, more than likely, you are one of those 1.5 billion people. Eventually, Maitreya will call on each and every one of us to help. You can start now. And those are the 3 ways that I would recommend, because those are the three things that I'm doing. So I love you guys. Thank you very much for listening. And as always, I look forward to putting up videos in the very near future. Have a wonderful rest of your day.